So, it's so nice to see all of you. Thanks for coming out today. My name is Darren Byler. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology here at the University of Washington. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my work in Northwest China, where I have spent a good deal of time living and studying, made a number of really great friendships with people that live in that space. I lived there for 2 years between 2014 and 2018, and so I'm going to tell you about what I saw while I was there and a bit about what's happening there now. So most of you probably recognize this guy, right? This is the president of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping. And every year he gives a talk to the nation. It's a State of the Nation address. And last year, in 2017, he talked about his future plans for this year, for 2018. And that speech was broadcast across the country. So whenever this happens, netizens get excited about what's going on in the speech, and they look at what's on the shelves behind him. So you can see there's lots of books and pictures and things. And so they go through his shelves, because it's in HD TV, so you can actually read them. And these bloggers, they figure out what he's been reading that year, what's on his shelf. And this year, he was reading this book, which is a book by Pedro Dominguez, who is a professor here at UW. He teaches in computer science. And the title of this book is called The Master Algorithm: How the Quest for the Ultimate Learning Machine Will Remake Our World. And it might be strange for you to think, you might be wondering, why am I talking about this book, about Xi Jinping, and what does it have to do with Uyghurs, which is a group in Northwest China I mentioned I spent a lot of time living with. And that's the question we're going to explore in this talk. One of the reasons why he's interested in artificial intelligence is because AI development in China is one of the leading things that the state is interested in over the next 12 years. By 2030, they want to invest $150 billion in this. And Uyghurs are one of the groups of people, populations, that is being assessed using these tools. So who are the Uyghurs? The Uyghurs are a group of around 11 million people that live in Northwest China. They refer to this land as East Turkestan. Back in the 1940s, they had their own state called East Turkestan. Uyghurs entered the historical record in the 9th century, when a group of people called the Uyghurs came from what's present-day Mongolia to this region. They're mostly farming people. They speak a Turkic language, which is really similar to Uzbek. And Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan are just right across the border, and so there's a lot of connections between those groups and the Uyghurs. For a long period of time, the Uyghurs have lived in relative isolation, way up there in Northwest China. But beginning in the 1950s, with the founding of the People's Republic of China, the state began to move large populations of people up there to secure the borderlands against what they saw as a threat from the Soviet Union. Most of those people that were moved from other parts of China lived along the border, way up in the north, right up there close to Russia. Uyghurs who lived farther south were still kind of isolated. That began to change in the 1990s when the economy began to shift in China. And it was when China began to move towards an export-oriented economy. So now today when you buy your clothes at Walmart or wherever you're buying them, Target, it says made in China, right? That's because China has shifted from an agrarian economy to an industrial and export-oriented economy. One of the things that they need to drive that economy is they need natural resources. They need oil, they need natural gas, they need all of the things that you need to run a big economy. And that's one of the reasons why they sent people to this part of China, is to get those resources. So Xinjiang, Uyghur Autonomous Region, has around 20% of China's oil reserves, natural gas reserves. It also has significant coal deposits and rare earth metals. When the people that were sent in the 90s arrived, they began to build out the infrastructure that would allow the state to extract those resources. So they built roads, highways, railroads. They built pipelines for oil and natural gas. Some of those infrastructure projects connected China to other parts of Central Asia and to Russia. But many of them went right into the Uyghur homeland, which is down here in this area. Another thing that they developed during this period was they began to introduce industrial scale agriculture. And so the economy for Uyghurs began to shift in some ways. Today, 38% of all cotton produced in China comes from this region. So if you're wearing something made of cotton that says made in China, you have a high percentage chance that it's coming from this part of China. The state was aware that Uyghurs were still wanting to have their own state, that they were wanting to have an East Turkestan. And they were also aware that the Uyghurs were not well integrated with the rest of the country, that there was a lot of poverty, especially in this area. And so one of the things that they were thinking about as they moved people there is that they would improve the economy, and through that, Uyghurs would become better integrated with the nation. But one of the problems with that approach was that a lot of these new industries, especially the oil and natural gas industries, were really just focused on Chinese migrant work, Han migrant work. So people that came from other parts of China, they found work in those industries. But Uyghurs were kind of excluded from those jobs. Uyghurs didn't have as much education background, and they also spoke a different language. And so many of the people that were running those companies, they said it was just too much work, too much mafan in Chinese, to allow these Uyghurs to work in these companies. So instead, Uyghurs, some of them began to work in the cotton farming industry, but many of them just saw themselves being kind of left behind. And so they thought that they were kind of losing their land. And one of the significant things that happened through this process was that the cost of living began to rise. And since Uyghurs couldn't find jobs in that new economy, they saw that basic staples were becoming more expensive. So we saw a rise in Uyghur discontent during this time. People became increasingly more desperate to find a better life, find a future for their kids. One of the things that came along with all that infrastructure build out, that hard infrastructure, was softer forms of infrastructure too, new forms of communication. First in 2000, TV arrived, so people started to watch TV for the first time. Then in 2010, 3G networks were introduced into the population, into the region. And 3G networks brought with them internet. Uyghurs were very excited about the internet as it arrived, and almost everyone started to buy a smartphone. So when I came there in 2011, all the young men had smartphones. Even old folks had smartphones. And they were using an app that arrived in 2012 called WeChat, which is a social media app very similar to WhatsApp. You might be familiar with WeChat itself. This app allowed Uyghurs to talk to each other using spoken word. So, because there's a speech function on it that allows you to talk to a whole group of people just speaking over your phone. And that was really liberating for Uyghurs, because prior to this, Uyghurs couldn't really use their language on smartphones. The keyboards weren't set up for it. And also, many Uyghurs don't have a lot of formal education, and so writing itself is a challenge for some of them. But because they could just speak, then they could start to talk very freely with each other. Also, they realized pretty quickly that the state wasn't able to really monitor what they were saying in Uyghur, because the censorship machines in China weren't able to pick up Uyghur spoken word. And so this allowed Uyghurs to have kind of a public, private space where they could talk about lots of things with a relative freedom. So a lot of what they were interested in was things to do with what's going on in the world, news. And also economic opportunities, things going on in the city. They began to download movies, watch movies, all those sorts of things. They also, though, began to talk about Islam, which has been the religion of the Uyghurs for centuries, but has been tightly controlled by the state until this happened, until the internet arrived. So they began to talk about Islam, or listen to messages about Islam that were sent from teachers based outside of China, Uyghurs based in Turkey, based in Uzbekistan, and Uyghurs that were actually based in this province itself. These were unauthorized Islamic teachers, and they developed really large-scale followings, mass followings on WeChat very quickly. So many Uyghurs were listening to these messages. Most of the messages were just about kind of normal forms of Islam, Hanafi, Sunni Islam. They were mostly interested in ideas around piety, like what does it mean to be a good Muslim? What is halal? What is haram? Haram means what's forbidden. Halal means what's acceptable. Had a lot to do with food, with dress, with praying and how you should pray, all of those sorts of things. Many Uyghurs got interested in Islam at this time, and at the same time began to move, because as they were getting internet technology, they began to see, oh, there's lots of economic opportunities elsewhere, and they also began to realize that their life was actually quite tightly controlled in the rural areas, and that in the city there's more freedom to practice Islam and to find jobs. And so Uyghurs began to move from rural areas, villages, into regional centers like Khotan, Kashgar, and Aksu, and then from there to the city, to Urumqi. And this is where I met people, is in Urumqi. That's where I lived for 2 years, and where I did my ethnography. So when I was there in 2014, this is what Islamic practice looked like on an everyday basis, but especially on Fridays. On Fridays, that's the main prayer day of the week. It's like Sunday for Christians. Many Uyghurs would come to the mosque. The mosque would be so full that people couldn't fit inside the mosque. There was thousands of people there. And so this is actually a relatively new phenomenon, just since really 2012 when people started to use the internet and talk more about piety, that people started to go to the mosque in large numbers like this. And the state was becoming aware of this, because it's obvious, like there's lots of people praying. And they were concerned. They thought it might lead to a threat to kind of the sovereignty of the state. A lot of the Islamic learning didn't happen inside the mosque, because the mosque space was seen as a space where it was still too tightly controlled by the state. So the imams that give the messages on Fridays, they have to get their messages approved by a censor, and then they just read that message. And so a lot of people that would go to the mosque, they would say, that's not real Islam. We have to study on our own. We have to listen to these tabligh, these teachings on our phones. They also began to study Arabic using this kind of technology. This is called a kalamkari. It's a pen speaker. You can just scan over Arabic text, and then it will tell you what that Arabic text says. And so you can memorize the Quran using that. So many people started to memorize the Quran to learn Arabic using these kind of devices. They also began to use this kind of technology. In addition to WeChat, they used SD cards that you could take in and out of your phone, and you could share messages that way. They also used like the Bluetooth technology to share messages. These were important devices for learning about Islam. A lot of the discussion around these messages happened in illegal prayer rooms that were close to the mosque in restaurants. And so I spent a lot of time in those prayer rooms talking to people about, why are they studying Islam, how are they doing it, and all of that. The mosque space also, though, provided an important economic center for people's lives. So a lot of these Uyghurs that were coming to the city were trying to find work, but really couldn't do it well, because there's a lot of discrimination when it comes to finding jobs in big companies for Uyghur speakers. And so most people just kind of started their own businesses, working in bazaars, selling a product. They would come to the Friday markets around the mosque and meet other people that came from the same hometown. They would buy products that people had just brought from the countryside. It was a really vibrant space. The market around the mosque on Friday there would be thousands of people there. This is the sort of things that many of these migrants would sell, just like shoes that they managed to buy or get on like a wholesale basis, and then they would sell them. A lot of the migrants I spoke with told me that putting money on their phone card was one of the most important things that they did in their week or their month. If they weren't able to put money on their phone card, they wouldn't be able to talk to their parents, they wouldn't be able to find economic opportunities, and they wouldn't be able to continue to learn about Islam and also kind of project a sort of Muslim persona online. So a lot of people started to talk about themselves on WeChat as being pious. It's like having a Facebook page or something, or Instagram page, where you kind of build a public persona and you want people to see you in a certain light. A lot of Uyghurs were starting to do that kind of thing. So let me just tell you about one of the stories of one of these young migrants that I met. I interviewed dozens of them, spent lots of time with lots of them. But this guy, Hassan, which is not his real name, it's a pseudonym, I think his story really exemplifies something that's happened to large segments of the population, the people I spent time with. So Hassan referred to himself as a pious traveler. So he said he came to the city in order to be able to practice Islam, but he also said he was a hard worker, someone who wasn't afraid, he wasn't lazy, wasn't afraid to work hard. He was a farmer growing up, but when in his late teens, he came to the city. And he also had a wife and small child. When I met him, he was around 23 years old. Hassan prayed 5 times a day in a particular mosque, or there was like 2 mosques that were okay for him. He said that those mosques had a higher number of people that were like him, like from the same sort of social economic status, came from the same hometown, but also poorer people. But he said that they are more earnest. They're more, they're like true believers in Islam. He also spent a lot of time in those prayer room spaces I mentioned. And he believed that movies, dancing, music, immodest dress, all of these things, he believed they were immoral. Although he still actually kind of liked movies and music and stuff, we would still talk about it, but he would say, you know, he shouldn't like it because it's like too worldly. It's not halal, he would say. When he first came, he sold jade, which is something that in that area of China, close to Hotan, is really one of the dominant trades for Uyghurs, because you can go to the dry riverbeds and dig through the stones and find jade. And in China, jade is one of the most precious stones. It's used in a lot of jewelry. So when he came to the city, he had a lot of this jade with him, and he was able to live off that for a couple of years, just selling jade. But eventually, his jade ran out, and he wasn't really willing to go back to the rural areas because there's lots of checkpoints, and also it's just a lot of trouble. And so he started to sell naan, which is a kind of bread. And then he quit that job and he started to sell shoes. He sold coats. He also got some day jobs like tearing down houses and stuff like that. He was finding all kinds of work, but it wasn't very regular work. And so he was sort of scrambling to provide for himself and his family. He was a prolific user of WeChat. He had like over 1,000 followers, which is, I guess, a lot. And he would post things almost every day about his Islamic practice. These are the sorts of things that one of his friends posted, and it's the sort of thing that Hassan would post as well. So I'll just read you the quotation. It says, and this is a translation of this text underneath here. It says that Prophet Suleiman approached his son and asked him, "I have received a message from Allah. I want you to circle the earth and see if there are more people who are alive or more people who are dead in spirit." After a period of time, the son returned and said, "Father, I went to many places, and everywhere I went, I saw more people who were dead than those who were alive." Suleiman said, "With the knowledge Allah has given to me, I know there used to be more people who were alive than who are now dead," I think is what he's saying. Or there used to be more people who are alive. Just leave it there. So what is this message? What's the message behind this? It's kind of hard to figure out, right? Like, what is he talking about? I think there's a few things happening here that we can detect. One thing that's going on is he's trying to be a little bit elliptical, a little bit, he's not being very direct in what he wants to say. And that's because he's realizing, he knows that there's, like, the police could be monitoring what he's saying, and that there could be some suspicion around him that he could be an extremist or a terrorist, which is something that people were starting to talk about at this time. So he's not being very direct in what he's saying. But he's also talking for kind of an insider. People that know about Islam, people that know about Uyghur culture, like, they would be able to tell what he's saying. He's saying that Uyghurs used to be more alive in spirit, used to be more pious, but now they've become dead in spirit. And he's saying we should be alive in spirit, like me, because he has a picture of himself like praying. So these are the sort of messages that Uyghurs were posting at this time. Around the same time as he was posting these messages, the state declared what they called the People's War on Terror. And this was in direct response to a number of incidents that happened, both in this province and in other parts of China. There were some violent incidents at a train station and in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, where Uyghurs attacked people, civilians, and killed a number of them. There was also a bomb that went off at the train station in Urumqi, the city where I did my research, and a truck that drove over a number of elderly Han people at a market. So in response to those incidents, the state declared what they called the People's War on Terror. They were taking up the rhetoric that came from the United States and elsewhere of the global war on terror. And they were saying, this is what it looks like in China. It's these Uyghurs that are carrying out these acts. They are also terrorists. And they used they used that language, but they used the imagery of the Cultural Revolution to talk about it. So these are the images they used to talk about the People's War on Terror. And it looks a lot like the Maoist period in the past, the 1950s and 60s, when counter-revolutionaries, people against the Communist Party, were represented as rats and should be killed by the people. So here the terrorists have become the rats, and the people, the Uyghurs, are supposed to rise up and kill them. So everyone should get involved and fight terrorism. The People's War on Terror, though, had a lot of different components, and it didn't just address people that actually carried out violent acts. It targeted everyone, including people like my friend Hassan. So one of the things that they implemented was what they called a green card system, or bianminka system in Chinese. This was a passbook system that asked all people from rural areas to go back to their hometown. People that had come to the city, they had to leave and go back to their hometown and ask the police for this card. This is kind of a good citizen card. They had to be able to prove that they had no criminal history, they weren't religious, and they didn't have any immediate relatives that had any sort of criminal history or religious extremism in their backgrounds. In effect, though, most Uyghurs were not able to get this card. Around 300,000 people that were living in the city at the time were forced to leave, and only around 10% were able to get the card. Most people couldn't get it because the police didn't give it to them. They would go and they would ask for it. They would ask for they need to get a stamp, and then they had to fill out some forms. And they would always tell them that the person that does that work is not here today, and so come back next week. So they come back next week, and the person was still not there, and they would just kind of drag it on like that. Then they started to figure out that the only way to get the card is if you pay kind of under the table to someone who's in charge of this system. So if you had a significant amount of money, around either 1,000 in some areas to 10,000 yuan, which is let's see, 1,000 yuan is just like $150, but it's still a lot for a lot of these folks. 10,000 is quite a bit for them. If you had some money, it's possible you could get the card. You still had to have really good political background, and you might also need to have some connections to local authorities in order to actually get approval. So for most people, it was actually really hard to get this card. The card was really a mechanism to exclude people from the city. It was something that promoted a kind of urban cleansing, a way of removing a population from the city. Han people that had rural hukou or household registration also had to get the card, but they could get it quite easily. So it really only affected Uyghurs. Around this time, they also began to erect barriers, walls around the mosque spaces to prevent people from having those bazaars that I was showing you pictures of a minute ago. And they also began to put up these posters that forbid any form of pious expression in the way people dressed. So it said you should resolutely oppose abnormal clothing and behavior and instead look beautiful, be beautiful. What it meant was that Uyghur women were not allowed to veil their face in any way. Men were not permitted to have beards anymore, and they weren't allowed to have symbols of Islam on their clothing. People that had these things in their public appearance as they went about their day, if they veiled themselves or had beards, they could be arrested. So all of these things together began to affect many, many people. And Hassan was one of the people that was affected by this. So in January of 2015, he told me, I'm being forced to go back. Meant back to his hometown. The Yaken, which is the name of the police of the place he was from, the Yaken police have been calling me every day, telling me I must come back. They are making my parents call me and tell me the same thing. When I ask why, they won't give me a reason. I don't have any choice. If I go to another city, they will be able to track me because of my green card registration, so I'm very afraid. Lots of my friends have gone back to Yaken because the police told them to come, and now they don't exist. I don't know where they are. No one knows. They have disappeared. Someone must have accused me of something or reported something I said online. There is no freedom in this world. For Uyghurs, life is very difficult and we have no freedom. I don't even know what I'm accused of, but I must accept their judgment. I have no choice. Where there is no freedom, there is tension. Where there is tension, there are incidents. Where there are incidents, there are police. Where there are police, there is no freedom. So several weeks later, Hassan went back to his hometown. He took his wife and daughter with him. And several weeks after he arrived back in his hometown, he disappeared. The police came and took him. We don't know what's happened to him. This happened in 2015, in early 2015, and since then his friends and family haven't heard from him. They don't know what's happened. They assume that he might have died during interrogation at the police station. Or he could be in the prison system. He could be in a detention center or a re-education camp. There's many places he could be. All they know is that he's lost, and they don't know if they'll be able to find him again, if he'll ever reappear. So this has happened to many, many people, especially young men. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how it's happening. Since 2009, which was a time when there was, well, I guess since 2007 on this graph, when there was violence in the area, the policing in the area has risen dramatically by over 1,000%. The budget for policing has gone from 4.5 billion to almost 60 billion renminbi. Right now, this area, this region, has the density of policing that's equal to the density of policing in East Germany before the Berlin Wall fell. And just in the last year or so, almost 100,000 new police officers have been hired. And they've also introduced a number of new surveillance systems. One of the things that they built in the Uyghur areas of the city was these convenience police stations. Every 300 to 500 meters, there's a new police station. And in those police stations, around 10 to 20 police officers are employed. They typically watch the cameras that are associated with these police stations, closed circuit cameras that are on the street. A number of those cameras, though, are artificial intelligence enabled. They do face recognition, so they can actually detect who's walking by the police station. And so the police officer just has to monitor if any alerts come up on the monitor, if any wanted person is walking by. The police officers also perform spot checks of people as they walk by too. So they ask for people's ID card and they ask for their phone, and they look on their phone for any religious activity, any extremist behavior. The people that have been sent back to the countryside now live between checkpoints. Uyghurs that went back to the countryside talk about living down in here as being in an open-air prison. So it's Hassan, who lived down here, if he wouldn't have disappeared, he would be living between two checkpoints. You're not permitted to go beyond the checkpoint unless you have some official reason to do it. So you need to have a doctor's notice or some kind of official document that would say you have to travel beyond the checkpoint in order to go beyond the checkpoint. This is what one of the checkpoints looked like that I went through in April when I was there in just this year, in 2018. This is coming off of a train station into a town called Turpan. And you can see that there's, or maybe you can tell, there's 3 lines. 2 official lines and 1 that goes through the back gate of the checkpoint. The back gate of the checkpoint has a police officer standing there who opens it for people based on how their face appears. So if the person looks phenotypically Han, then they just open the gate for them and let them through. They don't check their ID or anything. But if they look Uyghur, then they have to go through this checkpoint. So when I was going through this checkpoint, I was speaking in Uyghur to a bunch of women that were in this line. I said, oh, so the local people go through this one, and the people from other parts of China, they can go through that one. And they said, yes. And I said, well, which one should I go through? Because I'm not Chinese, and I'm not Uyghur. I'm not Han either. And they said, well, you're speaking Uyghur, so you should probably go through the Uyghur line, because I was talking to them in Uyghur. So I went through the Uyghur line. When I got to the front, I gave them my passport. I said, I'm not a local person. What should I do? And they said, oh, okay, well, we need to go to the police station and actually scan you manually. Because at the front of the line is a face scanning machine that will read your face and then match it to the picture on your ID. But since I had a passport, they couldn't do that. So they said I had to go to the police station and do it there. So that's what we did. This is what the face scanning machines look like. You put your ID card down on that, and then it matches the picture on your ID to your face. These face scanning machines are everywhere, not just at checkpoints, but also when you register for a hotel, sometimes at just the entrance to a neighborhood. There are lots and lots of places. And so the state is reading your face in many different areas and making sure it's you that's traveling through that checkpoint. Around this time, 2016, they began a new project called Physicals for All, which was a public health initiative, or that's how it was described, at least in the official media. And this required all Uyghurs to go to the police station and go to the police station and provide samples of DNA, fingerprints, their blood type. They would have their iris scanned. And then they did a 3D model of their face. So they take pictures of your face from all angles and make you do different expressions like happiness, sadness, anger. So they can get a read of what you look like when you're doing those things. And all of that is going to go into your file. They also ask people to record a voice message, reading it a few different times and at different speeds and volume, in order to get a voice signature for every person. So all of this data is then uploaded into the security system that integrates all of it together into a single security system. So 18.8 million people in the province participated in this program, which is around 90% of the total population. So even Han people also did this that live in the province. And that's sort of telling us that it was an obligatory thing, and people didn't actually volunteer to do it. They had to do it. If they didn't, they could be arrested. So once they've collected all that data, it's uploaded into this infrastructure project, which is called an Integrated Joint Operations Platform, which is not unlike what the TSA has here in the United States. They also have these sort of platforms that collect information about people. But I think their operations are supposed to be limited to the border. Here, it's an entire population of people is being assessed in this way. So this platform uses all that biometric information that's been collected through the public health initiative, but also includes things like the passbook information that they've had in the past, and when people go through the face scan checkpoints. It also looks through databases of health information and banking records, compares all of those things, and creates this giant file for each individual. It's also supported by smartphone spyware, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. So this is what a scan looks like on the street. When a checkpoint comes through, and when you go through a checkpoint and the police scan you, it looks just like this. This is also how they scanned my face when they had to do it manually in the police station, is they just used their smartphone and scanned me. It took them a while to get a good read. This is what the spyware that people have installed on their phones looks like. It's called Jingwang Weishi. It's a kind of nanny app, like a parent might have for their children to make sure that the children don't look at bad stuff online. They're using the same thing for Uyghurs. All Uyghurs have to have this installed on their phone. It's matched to your ID, and then it searches through your phone for unique identifiers. So it's looking for things associated for your social relations through images, through audio recordings, and through videos. So it can kind of figure out who is your social network, and it's going to see if there's anyone in that network that is flagged as a bad person that's wanted, or someone that's been arrested. So it compares all of those identifiers against a database in order to figure that out. It also, in some cases at least, is using a kind of AI-enabled auto-transcription and translation technology that will take Uyghur speech and automate the transcription and translation of it into Chinese. So they can detect now what people are saying. So before, when Hassan was putting all those messages up online and it said, you know, like, you're dead in spirit now, or we're dead in spirit and we need to like be more pious, like all of that is now going to be auto-translated into Chinese. And words like Allah or Huda, which means God in Persian, those are red flagged words, and it will show up immediately that this person is talking about religion. And so then they'll get a visit from the police, or if they go through a checkpoint and it has an alert in this app, then it'll be shown there, and the police will question the person. So when I went through checkpoints and people were having their phones checked, like this is happening right here, they would ask the person, what is the password for your phone? And then they would put in the password on your phone. You had to give it to them. And then they would open this app and they would make sure it's installed correctly and that there's nothing flagged on the app. So in addition to all of this technological surveillance and more kind of quantitative kinds of assessments, they also began a project in the spring of 2017 to get qualitative data on everyone, especially Uyghurs. So in this assessment, they were trying to decide which people are safe or unsafe or normal. That's what it says here on these columns over here. The unsafe people were people who had a number of these categories applied to, or these categories applied to them. So you started off, each Uyghur started off with 100 points. And if any of these counted for you, then you got -10. So if you're between the age of 15 and 55, you got -10, which is a big percentage of the population, especially migrants like Hassan. And if you're ethnic Uyghur, -10. If you're underemployed, -10. So all of those apply to Hassan, right? If you possess a passport, that's a -10. If you pray daily, like if you pray 5 times a day, -10. If you possess religious knowledge, like if you've used one of those pens to learn Arabic, or you've had someone teach you Turkish, if you've listened to a message on your phone, like on WeChat, or passing a message using your SD card, then you possess unauthorized religious knowledge, and that's -10. That was a really big one that caught a lot of people. If you visited one of 26 banned countries, which is a Muslim majority country, like a Central Asian Republic or one of the Middle Eastern states, then you have -10. If you've overstayed your visa when traveling abroad, -10. If you have an immediate relative living in another country, also -10. And if you've taught your children at home, if you've taught them about Islam at home, then you get -10. So many people were determined to be unsafe using this process. Part of the reason is because the first 3 categories apply to almost everyone. So it's very hard, you know, if you're between 15 and 55 and you're Uyghur and you're not well employed, which happens to almost everyone, you're already in a questionable category. You're barely normal still. But if you pray daily and have religious knowledge, then you've fallen into the unsafe category. So as a result of this, around 10% of the whole population of Uyghurs, which is around 1 million people, the Uyghur population is around 10 or 11 million, so around 1.1 million people, have been detained, and they've been sent to re-education camps. So the unsafe people have been sent to these camps, where they're going to be transformed through education. Many of the people that were detained not because they told these interviewers that they had religious knowledge. Like, who would say that? Yeah, I have religious knowledge. But because they did cyber crimes in the past, and the technology had caught them. So it had gone back through their internet history and found out who had listened to messages in the past. So someone like Hassan, who was doing this back in 2015, he would have been caught in this process. So over 1 million people have been sent to camps. Millions more that are still outside of the camps, that are maybe like normal to unsafe, like on the margin. Most of the people that live in villages are going through kind of night school or weekend school, where they get anti-religious education and political training. Over 1 million workers, government workers, have been sent to the villages to make sure that this is carried out well, and also to kind of assess the population, make sure that more people shouldn't be sent to the camp. So this is what one of the camps looked like at the beginning of this year. This is close to Urumqi, where a number of my friends are currently living. It's one of the largest ones. There's a aircraft carrier here for scale, so you can kind of see the size of this. It's since more than doubled in size just over the last year. So now it's one of the largest prisons in the world. This is a re-education camp, or a transformation through education center. There's over 180 of these actually. No, I should update this slide, that have been documented. And they hold between 2,000 to, in some estimates, 80,000 people, although we can't completely verify how many people are really being held. You can estimate based on the size, but you don't know exactly if it's full to capacity or not. In many cases, though, they are full. We've heard many reports that people are sleeping like 2 people to a bed, so they are kind of like spooning there every night. The prison camp system itself is really a minimum or medium security prison. So there's barbed wire, razor wire around the camp. There's armed guards that watch people all the time. Most people are living in dorms, like 20 to 40 people in a room, and oftentimes sharing a bed, like I just mentioned. They wake up at 6 a.m., make their bed, go out, raise the Chinese flag, sing the national anthem, sing some patriotic songs, and then they begin classes. Some of them are learning Chinese. That's one of the main things that they're being trained in, is Chinese language. Others are learning political thought, political education. Usually it's a combination of both of them. In the afternoons, people often have sessions where they stand in front of others and confess their crimes. So they say, you know, before I studied the Quran illegally, or I listened to these messages, now I realize that I was being led astray by this extremist ideology, and it's horrible. I'm so grateful that I've been saved from that. But I deserve to be punished, and so I'm very grateful that the government has placed me in this camp. Then the other people around them are supposed to also criticize them and say, yes, what you did was horrible. Why did you do that? You should be ashamed of yourself. People that perform well in these activities are given points towards their eventual release, because they're proving that they've been re-educated and that they've learned not to be Muslim. People that don't perform well, though, are often punished. So they're placed in solitary confinement, beaten in some cases, placed in stress positions. In some cases, they're forced to eat pork, which is a major violation of Islam for them. So there's psychological kinds of forms of stress and torture that people are going through. When I was there in April, people talked about these vans that patrol the streets and stop in housing districts as something that terrified them. They said if these vans stop at your housing district, it can mean that someone in your neighborhood is being taken to the camps or a detention center, and it could be you. You never know. And so as these things patrol the streets, people are kind of in a state of panic. Many people have a go bag of things that they're going to need if they are sent to the camp. So they have like warm clothes. If they have some sort of medical condition, they have medicine and things all ready to go. So because if the police come and they're going to take you, you have no time to, gather your things. And once you're in the camp, you often sort of disappear for long periods of time. You're not able to get visits from your family. Sometimes the family doesn't even know where you are. And so it's something that everyone's living in fear of happening to them. The mosque spaces that were so vibrant just in 2014 and 15 when I began my research are now completely empty. So on Fridays, this is what the mosque looks like. There's just absolutely no one going there. The front entrance to the mosque has face scanning machines, so they can check you as you go in. And so the state is monitoring people as they go to the mosque. And since one of the main criteria for being sent to the camps is if you're a religious person, many people have just stopped practicing Islam altogether. People used to pray after they ate a meal, and now they've stopped doing that. People don't greet each other using the Islamic greeting, Assalamu alaikum, because that's now been declared a form of extremism. So in general, the society is changing. Islam is kind of being eradicated from Uyghur everyday life. So what does all of this look like? How can we understand this process? And what's happening here is not simply that the Chinese government hates Muslims or hates Uyghurs, although it does kind of promote that at times. There's a lot of fear about Islam. There's a lot of Islamophobia in China. But there's also, I think, a sense of economic opportunity here for a good number of people that are involved in this process. That's why I call this terror capitalism, because it's a security industrial complex that involves large numbers of people and lots of money. So this complex relies on redundancy. So there's hundreds of thousands of people working in the system, manning those checkpoints, working as police officers, working as prison guards, working as teachers in the prison system, doing political work in the villages. Lots and lots of people are involved. And one of the things that that's done is it's turned tens of thousands of young Uyghurs, these migrants that I was spending time with, into security workers. So they're working as police. Many of them join the police in order to stay out of the camps, because that's one of the ways you can protect yourself and your family is if you work in the police force. Of course, once they join the police force, then they're not permitted to quit. If you quit, then it could be a sign that you don't agree with what the police is doing, and so you could be sent to the camps. And so once you join the police, then you're in the police for life. So that's one of the things that terror capitalism does. The technology that's being used, this AI-enabled surveillance and this apps on the phones and all of that, face scanning machines, they are used as a way of framing funding opportunities for local authorities. So you can get lots of money from the central government if you say you're going to implement all this new infrastructure. It's also, though, an incubator for AI development, which is one of the main drivers of Chinese economy, or the future of Chinese economy. Xi Jinping, remember I started this talk showing you a picture of Xi Jinping and reading a book about AI. He's really interested in AI. He thinks by 2030 China will lead the world in AI development. A lot of the cybercrime tools that they've used to crack down on Uyghurs have been some of the breakthroughs that have brought out new forms of technology in China. China already leads the world in these forms of computer vision technology. So the way you can make people in video searchable, that's a new phenomenon that's come out of this project. The way you can automate ethno-racial profiling, figure out the ethnicity of someone based just on their face, that's a new form that's come through this process. And also the automated transcription and translation, that I don't think has happened anywhere else, at least not to the same extent. This industrial complex also provides a safe space for counterinsurgency training, which is a key thing that China wants to kind of pioneer. So counterinsurgency means that you're going to control insurgents, right? That you're going to fight terrorism. And because one of China's big development initiatives is to move farther west into Muslim majority countries, they feel as though they're going to need a lot of this technology in order to secure their development projects. So like I said, there's a lot of investment opportunities, 150 billion in AI research by 2030. That's what the state is talking about. These are some of the leading companies that are involved in this. Face++, SenseTime, and Leon Technology, and Mia Pico. AI is projected to bring $7 trillion in Chinese GDP by 2030. Not just in relation to security technology, but in general. And so it's seen as something that is like a major source of revenue for the country. This is just a breakdown of some of the investment projects in some of those rural areas. Like for instance, let's see, the very top one where they invested $686 million in building a safe city for Yaken. That's Hassan's hometown. So you can see that many of these places are getting large investments for security development. This is what one of the tech spokespeople said recently about what's happening in the region. He said that over the last 10 years, the number of security companies in the province has risen to 1,400, which is up from just a small handful. and that this number will grow as China continues to develop along the One Belt, One Road, or the New Silk Road. He also mentioned that many of those new countries that are coming into this development project are Islamic countries, around 60% of the world's global Muslim population. So I'll read part of this quote from him. He says, "In order to ensure all aspects of security for the majority of Muslims, the government has spared no expense in heavily investing in the security industry. And this number is constantly increasing. The security industry in Xinjiang now represents a market opportunity of with huge and unlimited potential." So they're seeing this as a growth industry, something that could be expanded on. It's an experimental space, a laboratory where they're developing all these new technologies. So just to conclude, from Uyghur perspectives, what's happening through this project is a process of dispossession. They feel like they're losing their land, they're losing their autonomy, they're losing their way of life. They feel as though their spirits are being broken. That's how they often talk to me about it. They're really sad, very hopeless. But they say that their spirit, which means kind of their vitality, their life, that is being taken from them. They also talked a lot about how this whole generation of young Muslims, young Uyghurs, are being held in the military, or in the military-industrial complex, security-industrial complex, in the police force, working for police. Or if that doesn't happen, then they're sent into detention. So it's a whole generation of young people that are being processed in this way. That's their future. They also talk a lot about the eradication of Islamic piety, Islamic practice, and the way that it's affecting ideas around ethnic pride. Many young Uyghurs now feel like ashamed to be Uyghur. They would rather not be Uyghur, because if they're Uyghur, then it means that all of this can happen to them. From the state's perspective, what's being produced is a long-term solution to the problem, what they call the Xinjiang problem. They're going to produce permanent stability by making this space free and fair, and available for people to move in and take these resources, and also not to have to worry about Uyghur forms of Islam. They also see it as a growth space, something that will be used in other places, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, and in Africa. Han people that live in this region have a variety of perspectives on what's happening. Many people that have lived in this province for a long time and that grew up with Uyghur friends and Uyghur neighbors, they feel as though what's happening is kind of a major violation of Uyghur society, Uyghur rights. But they also feel like they have no choice but to submit to what's happening. They said they can't help Uyghurs, and so right now what they're doing is just keeping their head down. If they help them, if they are seen as allies, then they too can be put in prison, or at least demoted from their job. So it's, in order to kind of maintain their place in the society, they've decided to, in most cases at least, to just kind of stay silent. Others, though, that are involved in the security and occupation processes, mostly people that have just arrived in the last 10 years, many of them talked about what's happening as something that's necessary. They understood that it would be really difficult for Uyghurs, but they said in the long run, like, it will be a benefit for them because Uyghurs will be trained in Chinese thought, in Chinese language, and they'll become secular. They'll become modern. They often talked about Uyghurs as being backward and uneducated, and through this process they would get education. They also, though, exhibited lots of signs of kind of enjoying what was happening, or being happy with what was happening in some ways. Like, they would talk about how what's happening is already a success because they already feel so much safer, knowing that Uyghurs won't fight back against them anymore, that they can walk into Uyghur homes, Uyghur villages, Uyghur neighborhoods, and not feel any sense of threat. In the past, they often felt threatened or they felt uncertain about being in those spaces, but now they feel as though they can go anywhere and not fear anything. So they're sort of beginning to enjoy some of the privilege that they have, which maybe in the past they never had experienced. They hadn't experienced that kind of privilege in relation to another group of people. So they're kind of taking on the position of the conqueror. So I'll just end there. Happy to have any thoughts or questions you might have. It's not a happy story. I guess I should also say that Uyghurs are going to find ways to survive but it's not clear how. These people are strong. They have a lot of resiliency when it comes to suffering, and they've been through many forms of suffering in the past, and so they will find some ways to survive. But there's also going to be a great deal of trauma through this, and we don't know exactly what the outcome will be of these camps. They seem similar to other kinds of camps that have happened in other places, in other historical times. But we don't know. We don't know exactly what the outcome will be. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your attention. Yeah.
So what are your next steps in research as to like what you're planning to do?
Well, in relation to this, I'm paying attention to what's happening on the ground. One of the things that have happened recently is we've heard signs of, or reports of people being moved by train to other parts of China, people from these camps. We're also monitoring the growth of the camps, because the camps are getting bigger. And the Chinese state has started to respond to reports that have come from the media and from academics like me. And so now they're saying that, yes, we do have these camps. For a long time, they were denying that they have the camps, but now they're saying they have them and they're proud of them, that they're a good thing because it's a new strategy to deal with terrorism, and it's something that every country should consider implementing, is these sort of camps. They said that it's actually protecting human rights of other people in China, and so in that sense, it's not a human rights violation. That's what they told the UN just earlier this week. So we're monitoring the situation, we're paying attention to it. We're also working a lot with Uyghurs that are in the diaspora that have been able to leave to kind of help them to find asylum in other countries. A lot of them are now kind of refugee populations. And so there's some solidarity efforts there. But it's actually quite hard to do this research, because if you do research there, because if you go there, you're watched by the police. You have to go through all these checkpoints, and if you talk to anyone, those people can be questioned by the police, and so you're actually putting people in danger. So doing ethnography has become a lot more difficult. But I feel like it's my obligation to continue to try to tell these stories, and so I'll try. But it's something that you have to figure out as you go.
Does the Chinese government put in effort to suppress other religious groups as well, or is it specifically these Uyghurs that they're like focusing in on?
So there's two major groups in China that are seen as threatening to the state, the Chinese state. One is the Tibetans, and the other one is the Uyghurs, and they're both religious groups. The Tibetans have had similar things happen to them, not at the same scale though. So they've had camps also set up for Tibetans in the past. The party secretary who's in charge of this province where Uyghurs live used to be the party secretary in Tibet. And so he actually pioneered some of these camps there. But the scale hasn't been at this scale in other spaces. So it does really feel like Islam and the threat of terrorism, which is really just associated with Muslims in China, has amplified these kind of population control measures. I think the two reasons why Tibetans and Uyghurs have been seen as threatening are that, for one thing, that they have kind of a territorial claim to their land. So Tibetans want to have their own state, Uyghurs want to have their own state, and that's seen as a form of separatism, according to the Chinese state. And so it's seen as threatening because they want to have their own land. They have a claim to sovereignty. The other thing I think that's threatening to the state is that Uyghurs and Tibetans both speak their own language as their first language. Uyghurs speak Uyghur, Tibetans speak Tibetan. And so they're seen as not fully assimilated into the nation. And because of that, that's why there's more pressure placed on them to assimilate. Other groups that practice other forms of religion are also targeted, but not to the same extent. So there's lots of Christians in China, for instance, that are targeted, but they're not placed in camps in most cases. They're simply not allowed to continue to practice their faith. Maybe the leaders are detained or sent to prison, but the people that actually practice the faith are often just they try to disperse them or something. Other Muslims that live outside of this this area. There's also a large Hui Muslim population, which is a Chinese Muslim population that speak Chinese and can pass as Han. They're not given the same kind of treatment as these Uyghurs too. So that's why it makes us understand this as sort of an ethno-racial issue, that because Uyghurs look different, because they speak a different language, because they have claim to land, that's why they're being addressed in this way.
Is there any information on how female Uyghurs are treated? Because I feel like a lot of, at least your images and stuff, were all men. And is there any information?
So the largest population of people that have been sent to these camps are men. So because they're seen as the most threatening to the state, I think, and also because in the sort of stereotypes and sort of Islamophobia that circulates online, it's men that are the threat. They're the ones that are going to be the terrorists, right? So that's one of the reasons why men are targeted. There are Uyghur women, though, are sent to these camps. Many of the camps have 5 floors. And one of the floors is usually reserved for women, and then like 3 or so for men, something like that. So there are women in the camps. They're kept in segregated space for the most part. Many Uyghur women, though, are kind of without men in their villages or in their homes, and so now they're having to find ways to provide for their families while these men are gone. So there's a lot of trauma there as well. In the cases where a mother and father are both taken, the children become wards of the state. And so there's now tens of thousands of young Uyghur kids that are being raised in kind of orphanage spaces where they're being trained in Chinese. And so that's something that many Uyghurs are concerned with, is that these Uyghur children are now being trained outside of the Uyghur home. And so they're going to grow up not really understanding Uyghur culture, Uyghur language, or their Uyghur identity. We've heard some reports that their actual ethnicity is being changed on their ID card to Han, but we haven't been able to really confirm that in any sort of full way. So those are some of the dynamics. It's definitely an attack on sort of social reproduction, which is something that women are very involved with in any society. The state is definitely concerned with the children and wanting the next generation of Uyghurs to be different than the current one.
How does the treatment of Uyghurs compare and contrast with the historical treatment of Native Americans in the United States?
There's lots of similarities between the way Native Americans have been treated in North America and how Uyghurs are being treated now. One of them is the sort of residential school system, which was used for Native Americans, which took Native kids from their families, from their homes, to boarding schools, and then forced those kids to only speak English and also to learn about Christianity. There's some similarities to what's happening to Uyghurs in terms of the language that's being used in the boarding schools or orphanages, and also the kind of ideological training they're getting. They're not permitted to think about Islam or understand themselves to be Muslim. Instead, they're being trained to be patriotic and secular. So we can sort of see some similarities there. In terms of other issues associated with this, and the comparison, in the Native American case, a lot of the settler colonialism that happened in the American West or in Canada was associated with natural resources, people wanting land and wanting natural resources. And the same is the case here. That's really the driver behind a lot of what's happening in the region, is they want access to oil, natural gas, and all of those things, and they don't want to be threatened as they get access to it. But it's not just the land. They also want the people. So they want land and people to be subjugated to the state. The differences, I suppose you could say, between the Native American experience and this experience is that in the US and in Canada it was actually much worse, because people died in large scale through the process of settler colonialism here. It was really genocidal in how it was done here. Whereas in this case, we don't have instances of mass death. People are dying in the camps, mostly people that are elderly or not, their health is not as good. Although there's some cases like Hassan, possibly, where people die in interrogation through beatings and things. But it's not in general what's happening. So if we start to see that, then we could say, oh, it really is a genocidal program that the state is carrying out. So far, it feels like they mostly just want to eliminate the societal and cultural aspects of Uyghur life, religious aspects, and transform the population into kind of a Chinese population.
How is the rest of the world viewing this? Like, is there like sides that they're on? Or
Yeah, there are sides that people are on. That's an interesting way to put it. So in most cases, people are not speaking out against it because I think one of the reasons is China is a very important player economically for most nations, and so standing up to China on this issue would mean that it would affect your trade relations with China. So most Muslim majority countries actually are not speaking out against this. They actually have extradition agreements in many cases, like in Egypt or in United Arab Emirates, to deport Uyghurs back to China if China says they want them. So they're not speaking out against it. The only exception to this is in Turkey, where because Uyghurs are a Turkic people, there's a lot more affinity between Uyghurs and Turks. And so they've made some statements against it. There's also a large population of Uyghurs living in Turkey. And so Turkey has, to some extent, stood up for them. Most of the opposition, though, to this process has come from the West, from Germany, from Sweden, from Canada and the United States. And there's different ways that they're framing it. In Europe, they talk about it as a human rights violation, as a crime against humanity. And in the United States, to some extent, although I think the Trump administration would like to frame it instead as a threat to religious freedom. And so they've talked about it in those terms. So far, though, there hasn't been any real legal action in terms of like sanctions against these companies or the leaders that are involved, but there's some talk of it. So it might come through. The next step, I think, is to get the UN more heavily involved in the situation and to have them make formal statements about it. But it takes a long time to kind of prove that this is happening on the ground and also get people, interested enough to take a stand.
You talked a lot about how your ethnographic work can put other people in danger, but did it ever make you feel like you were put in a dangerous position, or were you mostly safe because it was clear that you were a foreigner, not like a Uyghur and so on? Right. So for the most part, I didn't feel a sense of danger for myself. It does, though, it is getting more increasingly, I am increasingly feeling more danger, though. So this last time I was there in April, I found out after the fact that they had been watching me on I think the camera systems as I walked through the city. They interrogated another foreigner about my activities while I was there several weeks after I left. They asked him, what had I been doing? They wanted more detail. And he didn't even know I was there. He didn't really know me, so he couldn't really tell him. But he told me after the fact that they had done that. And they had threatened this other friend of mine, or acquaintance, with a 10-year prison sentence. They took him from his home and his wife and his child, and took their passports away from them, and said, you're not arrested, so you don't get a phone call to your embassy to let them know what's happening to you. We just want to question you. But during interrogation, they threatened him with a serious criminal charge. They said that he had released state secrets, which is like an espionage kind of charge. And so he had to sign a confession of some sort in order for them to let him go. And eventually they let him go and just gave him they said he's banned from going to China for 10 years. So those are the sorts of things that can happen. And it's enough to make my partner, my spouse, not want me to go back. She says that I've traveled there enough and I can do quite a bit from here. That there is always that threat that that the police could say you've done something and then you could go to prison. It's something that can happen very quickly.
At this point, do you believe the Chinese state would allow you to return to continue your research?
I don't know. It's possible. I have a 10-year visa that should allow me to travel. But since I was there last in April, I've done a lot of speaking and public speaking about what I saw. And I've also spoken to
the Canadian government about it, to the Canadian House of Commons. And so I think that by now I'm probably on some sort of list and being watched very closely. I could try it. They might simply just watch me as I travel and stop me from accessing certain things that they think are too sensitive. But it's hard to know for sure.
How would you compare this to the Rohingya crisis that's currently happening in Myanmar?
There's some interesting parallels to the Rohingya crisis. One of the things that's interesting about it is that China is involved in both of them to some extent. In Myanmar, China is interested in building, in gaining access to ports along the land where the Rohingyas' homeland is. And so there's some, at least, speculation that China was kind of pushing Myanmar to move that population out of that space so they could have access to it. So there we could see some parallels to kind of a settler colonial or a terror capitalist kind of development. In general, though, there's a lot of differences. So, I mean, one of the things that happened in the Rohingya case was they were just burning villages and killing people kind of point blank and burying them in mass graves. There's also lots of sexual violence, with people being raped by army personnel. And they also actually wanted the people to leave. They want them to go to Bangladesh. They say you should be living in Bangladesh, not in Myanmar. In the Chinese case, they don't want the Uyghurs to leave. They want them to stay. They forbid them from leaving. They won't give them passports. Having a passport is actually one of the reasons why you can be sent to the camp. The borders are closed in almost all cases for Uyghurs to leave. One of the reasons for that is they're afraid that Uyghurs will go to Turkey or maybe to Syria, where there is maybe around 3,000 Uyghurs in Syria that have been fighting, usually against ISIS, but fighting in wars, in the civil war in Syria. And they're afraid that Uyghurs will get training in weapons, that they'll learn how to militarize, and that they'll somehow come back to China, or that they'll attack like soft targets, like embassies outside of China. And so they're afraid that if they let the Uyghurs out, that they'll just come and attack them in return. Actually, most Uyghurs, when they leave, they're just so happy to be out that they have no plans to do any of that. But the state is still very concerned about it. They feel like Uyghurs are their citizens, that they're their people. And so they want to kind of maintain control of them and kind of break them, to make them Chinese.
How did you decide upon the Uyghur population as something that you wanted to study? Was it like familial background or something like that, or people you knew? How did you hear about it?
So my background is in photography. When I was an undergrad, like you all, I was trained in photography as a photojournalist. And so I first went to China and to Asia as a photographer, working for an NGO. And at the time, I didn't know Chinese, didn't know that much about China. But I had the opportunity to travel to a number of different areas throughout Asia. And one of those was the Uyghur area, to Xinjiang. And I was really taken by the region. I didn't know anything about it, that there would be these kind of oasis cities where people live in sort of courtyard housing complexes. I don't know if you've seen pictures of like Cairo, or if you watched a movie called The Kite Runner, which is based in Afghanistan. That movie was actually filmed in the Uyghur city of Kashgar because it's so similar to what it looks like in Afghanistan. So seeing that as these cities in China was just really surprising to me. And I could also see when I went there in 2003 for the first time that there was lots of changes that were happening, that there was people moving into the region, that there was this new interest in oil and natural gas, and so that the society was going to change very quickly. And so that's what made me interested in actually studying the area, because I thought I could see that there was going to be a lot of changes in the area. I didn't realize that it would escalate in terms of violence and like a camp system and all of that when I first started. I just thought that this is like an interesting space, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But unfortunately, it's turned worse and worse as I've been studying the region. I also didn't realize that it would take so long to learn Uyghur and learn Chinese. It's a long process to learn those languages, but it was really rewarding also. So I met so many great people and made so many great friends. It's sad now, though, that some of those friends are in these camps.
Is this an issue that if you went to somewhere like Beijing or Shanghai, you'd hear about it a lot, or is it kind of not talked about at all in Chinese media?
It's not talked about very much at all in Chinese media. So it's something similar to how in the US, like when we were having wars in Iraq or in Afghanistan, like we know it's happening, but we don't really know that much about it, and it seems really far away, and like it doesn't really affect us, and that it has nothing to do with us. That's how many people in China feel about it, that they don't know much about it, and it's far away. A lot of this, though, has to do with the control of state media in China. So there's no free press to speak of, so people aren't really able to speak in open ways about what's happening. That prevents a lot of people from really hearing about it. Most people that you speak to outside of the region would talk about what's happening there as just simply state security being implemented, and that it's a net good for them because they're being protected from the terrorists. So there's a lot of this kind of stereotypes that circulate about Uyghurs, about this part of China as being kind of the source of terrorism and the source of threat. And so if the state is intervening, it makes them feel safer.
And I guess to kind of build up onto that, do you think this will turn out something like the Tiananmen Square protests where they just kind of remove it from the history and it's not really talk about it? Or I guess before they knew that they had these camps, was that the case, where they just kind of acted like, oh no, there's literally nothing going on here?
It took a long time for them to admit that the camps were actually existing. Although you could, if you read Chinese, you can figure it out because there's like bidding contracts for building them, and like, you know, like the security people talk about like how sophisticated their security equipment is and stuff, and so you realize, oh, they actually have all this stuff and they're using all of it. But in official media releases, they didn't actually talk about it as a camp system or anything. They said they didn't exist. Then just recently, in the last month or so, they've said, oh yeah, we do have these camps and they're great. They're changing the population and it's gonna like have this wonderful outcome. So they've now admitted to it. So it will be in the history books, I think, because it's already been admitted to. But they're not going to admit that it's, you know, tearing apart Uyghur families. What they say is that people are going to these camps voluntarily, that they see them as a benefit for them, and so they're just going to the camps because they want to learn Chinese or learn how to be patriotic or something. So they're not going to say that they were actually placed in the camps, or that the camps are actually prisons, or that there's like, you know, forms of psychological torture, that people are not being permitted to practice their faith, because they say that, no, the mosques are still open. We just have checkpoints in the front, but the mosques are still functioning. So they have ways of kind of obfuscating or gaslighting what they're doing, while still admitting to parts of it. So there's a lot of sophisticated people involved in marketing or telling the story of what's happening. I think, though, most people in China will probably not really ever know how kind of horrific the circumstances are for Uyghurs. Yeah.
You had said earlier that prisoners of these camps essentially could build up points by appearing to be better citizens of what China wanted, and not like Uyghurs. Is it common that people do get out of these camps? Is it common that they do return to society?
So far, it's not common at all. There's been a few people that we've seen documentation on that have been released. Most of them are elderly people or people that their health is not good. So it seems as though they've been released for those reasons. There was one UW student who was released. She was a Hui student that went back to visit her boyfriend last November or October. And in order to kind of keep up with her homework, she uploaded her homework to Canvas, which is what all of you use to upload your homework here. But you might not know it, but when you upload your homework to Canvas, you're using a VPN, which is a system that the state can't control, the Chinese state can't control. In order to get to Canvas, you have to use a VPN. And so because she did that, they said that she was involved in some suspicious activity. And so they sent her to this camp. because they couldn't control what she was doing when she was uploading her homework. And so they sent her to a camp, and she was there for about 4 months until her father was able to kind of bribe someone to have her released. And so now she's been released, but she's still not permitted to come back to UW, come back to the United States. And so she's just living there. They won't give her her passport back, and so she's not able to actually travel. So that's the sort of thing that can happen. You can get released at times, but then once you're released, then you're still watched very closely, and like you're not ever really, or so far at least, people haven't been able to leave the region. There are a few people that have left that were actually Kazakhstani citizens, people from Kazakhstan, that were kind of taken by mistake. The state didn't realize that they were from Kazakhstan. And then after the Kazakhstan government intervened, then they said, oh, yeah, I didn't realize you're a Kazakhstani citizen, and they let them go. And so those are the people that have told the most stories about what this situation is like, because they've actually been released and now are in Kazakhstan, so they can speak freely. Any other questions? Well, thanks so much for hanging out. Appreciate your attention. Hopefully you learned something and it wasn't too depressing. But good to see you. Thank you.